Welcome to episode 13 of the Alcon Maddox War Plan webinar series. I'm Richard Ritchie. Today I'm excited to be joined again, actually, by my good friend Abe Seksek, the Chief Operating Officer of Rainmaking in MENA and Russia. Say hello, Abe.
Hey everybody, how are you?
Yes, I'm sure they're all great. So look, for those of you who don't know me already, I run a niche recruitment and executive search firm based here in the UAE, and we specialize in sourcing sales and leadership talent for the IT channel industry. The typical roles that we work on are channel and partner management positions, heads of sales, directors of sales, commercial directors, and then you've got the VP of sales, country manager positions, and GMs, of course, as well. Now, I've actually spent the last 25 years building and managing high-performing sales teams, so I know very well just how important it is to install the right type of commercial leader within an organization. They have a direct impact on value. Not only is that important when we're looking to grow our businesses, but also in times of crisis like we're in today. These positions are important to protect the underlying revenue that we've worked so hard to generate in the first place. So if any of you on the call today would like to get an insight into our talent targeting system, to see how we're able to identify the top 15% passive talent in the market for our clients, then please just type the word talent in the chat box, and then what I'll do is either myself or one of my team will reach out to you in the next 48 hours to give you some more information on that and how we may be able to assist you as an organization. Now, that said, today is not about me, nor is it about recruitment. It is actually about you, and I'm specifically now talking to business managers in the IT channel industry. Now, over the past few months, I've spoken with many of you on the call today to get a better sense of what are your top of mind challenges in this time of COVID-19. Now, some of you have already become part of the mastermind community, and that's really been set up to help us tackle this crisis head on from a business perspective. Now, these top of mind challenges are really what's been driving the content of this webinar series over the past 4 months. And it's really my way of giving back to the IT community. So, you know, in a way to, first of all, bring us together, but also to make sure we set ourselves up to thrive rather than simply survive during this very tough and challenging period. Excuse me. Now, over the past 4 months, some of you already know the topics we've covered, things like the increased threat to cybersecurity born out of working from home, fast-tracking digital transformation, which actually Abe was sharing his insights on a couple of months ago as well, managing a partner ecosystem during a crisis, solving business problems with AI, and then more recently switching from a CapEx to OpEx model with cloud computing. Now, each week we bring on different industry experts to help us piece together strategies to overcome these very real challenges. At the end of this series, we'll be looking to compile all these strategies in the form of a white paper. So if you're interested in receiving a copy of that white paper, please stay to the end of the session today, and I'll give you some information on how you can obtain a copy. So the focus of today's session is it the right time to pivot? And in my mind, there's really no better person to guide us through this than Abe Seksek. So before you do that, Abe, why don't you give us a little bit of insight into who you are, what you do, and why this topic resonates with you so much?
Okay, thank you, Richie. Again, my name is Abe Seksek. Actually, my real name is Ibrahim, but everybody knows me in the ecosystem as Abe. What we do is, I currently man a company called Rainmaking, which we have three major pillars of our businesses. And the first one is we run an accelerator for startups. It's called Startup Bootcamp. We own this brand globally. We have programs running from every corner on earth, from Australia to Mexico. We have 3 programs in MENA right now. We also, our second pillar of business is we find corporates. And we link them up with late stage startups or scale ups so they can expand their business. And the third thing that we do that we're really heavy on, and what is very relevant to this topic, is we do venture builds. So we build companies from the ground up with corporates to certain to target or to tackle certain aspects of their business that they want to address. And this question, and I also co-host a show called The Pivotal Show, talks about pivoting and talking about adding either new features or products or even completely changing the business. And that is a show that we started actually during the pandemic um, um, with me and my two co-hosts who also help as mentors in our programs for startups. And I know Richard as well on those programs. He mentors a lot of our startups there. And
it's quite interesting. Hey, just to jump in a second, you mentioned obviously startups, Caroline. You
yeah,
obviously come from a corporate background, but now you're obviously quite heavily involved in the startup community. It's
sure.
interesting because pivot, at least to me, is often associated with startups. But the reality is, pivot isn't a word that should only be used for startups, right? And I think that's the reason why we're discussing this topic today, because there are more and more companies, because of the current situation, they're in this. They find themselves at a crossroads, if you like, where customer needs are changing, the market's evolving. They're questioning, is their current business model even relevant? So there is an inherent need to consider pivot. And again, just to be clear, we're not necessarily talking about a complete overhaul of their existing business, which is what
that's
some
correct.
pivot is.
It could see the term pivot actually became very popular with the startups, but in all fairness, it is not just startup based. It's, you know what I mean, any company, any SME, any tech firm, even major corporations, they pivot. And a pivot, there is a misunderstanding what a pivot is. A lot of people think a pivot is a complete business change, like, they're doing A, now they're doing B. That's not the case. Sometimes companies go, and I say companies, not startups, they go through a series of mini pivots that, down the road, like after a couple of years, it looks like this company was able to maneuver out of a certain situation and completely change their business. So it just became very popular in this era of all these startups and the tech startups and what's happening globally right now. So, but the pivot actually has been there forever, but maybe not as known as a word, I guess, than it is in these days.
I think also I think perhaps the reason why it's gained more exposure from the startup community is, I guess, it's a lot easier if you assume that a pivot is a complete overhaul of a business, then it's a lot easier for a young company to pivot because they're just restarting in a sense. But most of the companies that I'm having conversations with now, they're clearly not startups. They're multi-million-dollar organizations, they're SMEs or SMBs, if you want to define them. So this is really the question. It's like, should we pivot? Is really, I guess, a worry for some companies, because they're like, well, my existing customer base is changing, their needs are evolving to the extent that I don't recognize perhaps some of my customers anymore. So there's an inherent understanding that, yes, I need to change, but what can I do to mitigate the risk of perhaps making a wrong decision, right? And this is really what's driving this conversation, I think, at the moment.
Yeah, and I agree with you. Like, when we talked, every business leader, whether it's a startup or a CEO of a multinational corporation, they always have ideas coming up, you know what I mean? But then because their business is driving them in a certain way, they really didn't have the time or didn't put that much effort in execution of these new ideas, right? But then I think the word pivot became super, super popular in the last 4 months with the pandemic, because a lot of people's way they do business, what they were offering as products, what they were offering as services completely changed. And people had to adapt into a new way into a new order of business, right? So again, the pivot is not only changing the business, it could be even changing the way you do things. Internally, how you like the workflow of anything that you start can also pivot into a much either more flexible or more lenient or even more efficient, sometimes even less efficient, but to make sure that like right now, going back to office is a big issue for a lot of companies. I know they're slowly back trickling back on to their offices, but you know there was IT had to pivot from these rules of saying like these premises are only allowed to access certain applications, and now they had to open it up for people's houses. So there was a lot of that pivotal thinking, I guess, happened even on a department level, even on a process level. So really
Yeah.
pivots happen everywhere, not only as a business sense, but it also happens in that sense of how you do the business itself.
Yeah, Corey, I think when we talk about business process or the having to accommodate different behaviour in the workplace, I think Siemens have come out and made a massive announcement over the last couple of weeks. They've announced that I think their German operation, 140,000 workers, are now allowed to work from home indefinitely. There's no time period stipulated there. They can work from home for 2 to 3 days a week every week. And that's a massive recognition more than anything that there's not going to be a post-COVID-19 world, which is what many people have been touting. The reality is there is pre-COVID and there is COVID. So we know already the kind of behaviors that we will have to accommodate. We know perhaps any reconfigurations of workspaces that we need to provide for. So they've just said, yeah, we know, we're doing it. And I think that's a very bold and perhaps a very clear way of thinking, And I think more and more companies.
And it just shows you like the pivot, this pivot moment, and the pivot is all about the way of thinking, and it's not really what they execute. But like a lot of people keep wanting to add things to their business, but either have no time or really doesn't fit in their business, and that is where we come to the three pillars that we wanted to talk, me and you, about for pivoting. You know what I mean? And the first one is, and it's always, a lot of people think it's a yes and no answer, and sometimes it is, um, but there's a lot more deeper conversation to have with, especially stakeholders in the company. In bigger companies, the C-suite would sit and discuss these points and see how close are they from reality. But even in smaller businesses, SMBs, and even SMEs and startups, there's usually it's done from at least one to two, probably three people that act as a sounding board, because they are pitching ideas to each other, and they think, okay, what do you think if we do this, and how can we validate that there's a product, that there's a need for this product, and all that good stuff. So I'm gonna go right through the first one and say finances, and that's usually a yes or no answer. Do you have the money to operate such a plan? You know what I mean?
What does that mean? There's two things here, right? So, and I guess it really depends on how you're planning to execute, because finance is to take on a completely new revenue stream, in addition to what you're currently pursuing. It's perhaps a very different assessment to wanting to down tools on an existing one as well, right? Because the existing stream may be dwindling, but it may not be completely obsolete yet, at least. So there's a clear assessment of what is the what's the opportunity and the opportunity cost as well, I guess.
Yeah, and the thing is like when I talk about finances, because a lot of times people want to add like a brand new product, and if they have to build an actual product, like either a tech item or even a physical item, and then that requires a lot of time. It requires a lot of finance in actually building the actual device. There's a lot of R&D in it, so you're probably going to have to talk to. It probably won't be able to be done in house unless you're that big of a facility. So you're going to have to get external vendors out there, and all of that requires a lot of effort and a lot of finance, because getting something like that would require a lot of money, and a lot of companies, especially during the pandemic, were barely able to survive. And so adding another product is just going to add a lot to the burn. So you want to control the burn as much as possible, because
Right.
because we know a lot of the businesses had a lot of customer facing aspect to their business, and with the
Mm.
pandemic there was a lot of Zoom calls, but there wasn't still that you know interaction of face to face, and so a lot of the business did suffer. And so burning through whatever cash reserves you had was very, very, very important, just to make sure what kind of how long can you hold up before God
Mm.
forbid, you go out of business, or going out there and seek funding, or find a new investor, or find a new partner, which still
Yeah.
takes a lot of time and effort. So finances is a very, very important part. And um,
Most
and
of the I've been having these conversations with, they obviously the thing they're having to consider at the moment, even before they entertain, let's say, pivoting, um, in order to keep costs down short term, and the kind of time period that people have kind of stipulated to me has been 6 months, right? We're good for 6 months, um, even during the most atrocious of
stringent times.
crises.
Yeah.
Uh, Before we're in a position where we have to lay people off or make salary adjustments or what have you. But yes, if they get to that stage already and then they start to consider pivoting, which is, I think, the reality is what a lot of companies have had to do, right? Because I think when this pandemic first started, there was a period within which companies were, and they can be forgiven for really thinking, okay, let's just hope that this goes away. But obviously, I think everyone's now realised that, well, this isn't going away. This is the new norm already. We need to reposition ourselves. So there will need to be perhaps an investment that wasn't anticipated. So where do they get those funds from if they don't have the war chest that they perhaps already spent just keeping everybody in play?
So, that's a question I get asked almost on a daily basis, especially in my role, because a lot of people are usually seeking funds,
Yeah.
and seeking funds is, the issue with it, there's a couple of main issues about that. Is it's very time consuming from the founders' time. So instead of the founders, going, being locked up with the R&D and all the product people to actually get this product out there, it takes a lot of time and effort to reach out to people saying, we have
Mm.
this great idea, we're looking for X amount of dollars or dirhams, and then so that takes a lot of time and effort. The other thing is obviously more established companies would seek traditional funding, like bank loans, and
Right.
you
Yeah.
know what I mean,
Banks
or
are
or
happy to
friends and
give away.
family. Yeah, or friends and family. And friends and family is, obviously, usually that's the first thing people usually approach. But again,
Mm.
it goes back to the argument of smart versus dumb money, I guess. And
Yeah.
and smart money is what you need, because smart money usually opens doors for you. And
Mm.
and so you're looking for that partner. You want to bring on board that could add a lot of value, especially if they're an industry expert in that domain that you're pivoting into. And if they bring in a bit of cash with them, that even makes it like a better deal for everybody, right? So, but that is something that I personally try to avoid, because it is very, very time consuming to go
Mm.
out there, unless you have a full trust in your team, which you should by now. But then you won't be involved. But it's really a catch-22, because a lot of
Mm.
times, people tell you, okay, can you explain more about the pivot? But because you're not as involved, so you can't really
Yeah.
explain, so you can't really raise the money, and it's a vicious cycle from there. And that's why you
Yeah.
mentioned something, a key. You want to know how much you're safe for the next couple of months. And I know a lot of companies took either side, either went on a, slashing salaries from day one. Some people said, no, we're good for the next 3 to 6 months. But a month or two into it, started thinking, okay, how do we add more features? How do we add a new product? How do we pivot? All that good stuff. So in my opinion, those are the good leaders who, have always has a good laid out plan for the future.
Yeah, but it's interesting. Right at the beginning of this pandemic, I was talking to one company that they had a very clear strategy in that they required all of their employees, board included, to take a haircut, which is something I haven't done for many years, as you can see. So they're taking a salary adjustment, but the reason behind the salary adjustment was not to just cut costs in order to ride out the store. They were cutting costs because they were repositioning themselves. They were bringing forward projects that were on the back burner that were quite honestly never going to make it off the back burner. But they saw the opportunity to do that and wanted to fast track it. So that short-term adjustment that everybody bought into has now enabled the company to reposition itself for growth. And we've actually got a conversation with them next week, and they've got a lot of hires that they need to make over the next few months because of this switch in direction, which means obviously the salary adjustments that have been made have been worthwhile from a strategic standpoint, and obviously those people within the organization will be paid back now that they're returning to growth. But it was just a very interesting it was interesting to talk to the leaders of the organization so early on, because they were very they bit the bullet early on and made the decision, right? Whereas it's this period of indecision, I think, actually hinders companies from making pivots, because the longer you hold off, the less likely it is an option, right? Especially when you consider things like cash burn, because they just don't have the resources they have to accommodate such a change are no longer there.
Yeah,
you're absolutely right. This is quite clearly a very important factor. Well, just a question to people listening at the moment. And what are your guys' thoughts on what we're discussing at the moment with regard to the finances, the definition, if you like, of pivot? I'd be really interested to hear some of your insights into, is it something you're experiencing in your business? Whether your organizations have pivoted, or is something that's on your mind at the moment? So the second part of this, then, if part one, or strategy one, if you like, Abe, was to get your finances in order, and the second part, and in these, I don't think they're necessarily one follows the other. There are more three to run in parallel to some extent. It's really the team that's in place, right? So talk us through that, by getting the team in order.
So again, talent, we always talk about talent and how important talent is to any business. And this is also, especially now, and we're talking about like, I'm dealing right now with a couple of companies who are legacy companies of 40 and 50-year-old businesses. And after the pandemic, these are companies that are making in hundreds of millions of dirhams a year.
Yeah.
And suddenly, they had, as you said earlier, as you said right now as well, they had many projects on the back burner, but because they're making money, they really never saw the light of day, right? And now, they're reaching out to me and reaching out to a lot of these people who are talking about digital transformation and talking about pivoting. And so, but when you sit down with these people, they do not have the internal skills to actually do what they want to do, and the good companies understand that they don't have that talent and that they need to go out and hire this talent for those specific cases. But for younger companies or startups, a team, finding that specific talent can really make you or break you, because they would bring in all the knowledge, because I'm a big believer of a lot of people can do a lot of things on their own, but when you hire talent, it's just decreases the time to your goal. You know what I mean? Like, like I remember you and I worked together one time, right? We worked in the same company, and we kept questioning why they brought in somebody from whatever company, right? But then I understood in the end saying, okay, and instead of us learning on our own, it takes us like a year. They bring in somebody, and then that cycle drops to 3 months. And so talent plays a big part in how fast you get into the pivot or the offering or the product that's coming on, as
And I guess
well
that's
as
in the assessing the finances as well, right? So if you're going to pivot into something, understanding first of all that you need new talent, or you perhaps need to upskill your existing talent, is something that clearly needs to be considered when you're trying to understand how much is this pivot going to cost.
exactly, and keep in mind there's a lot of talent that can be taught. You know, especially if it's the pivot is not very off of its base, so that's a training issue. But even if it's a major pivot and you have some staff who are very talented or who have a great appetite to learning new things, so that's something you can definitely train.
Yeah.
But again, adding more talent that tackles that specific issue that you're pivoting into will tremendously help your cause, will tremendously help you in also gaining customers, because customers would want to know if you've done this before, what kind of experience do you have. And so recognizing the need that talent is a major component in the pivot is honestly, in my opinion, a pivot for some of these leaders, because a lot of them do not understand that. They think, well, this is tech. Well, no, there's a million verticals in tech. So, I've had a very good conversations with a lot of decision leaders in UAE and in the surrounding countries about these topics, and I've had some conversations that were let's just say they weren't very stimulating at all. So people clearly they think that, as you said earlier, things will come back to where it was. Well, we are in a new world. They will normalize, but our new normal will not be the same old normal. That's what what we'll find that out. So that's I can't stress how talent is important. And I think we talked about examples earlier. I can remember. I remember one of the examples was like the Michelin. When Michelin they actually pivoted into the restaurant business by issuing Michelin stars. But you can get the executives from the tire company to actually give out quality stands for restaurants. So that's an example of a complete pivot. And I think the only thing shared is this, like the founder of both companies are the same guy. This guy had something in the back burner, and he wanted to do this for the longest time. While you had companies, like an online company adding a product that would serve not their main source of revenue, but their other source of revenue. That's like a mini pivot. So there's a lot of difference, and every one of these needs a different type of talent.
I think the pivot is more the focus. So, like I said, if you're having to switch the focus of either your staff or your finances to another direction, that is ultimately what the pivot is, right? And I think the focus thing is the key thing for me, because that's ultimately because sometimes focusing on the wrong thing is a distraction, right? And that's the risk. If it's not a commitment that's made solid by the leaders of the organization, it's a distraction that can lead to the detriment of the existing business streams, or the existing revenue streams rather. So there needs to be that assessment. Okay, if we are going to do this, what it needs to be made clear. What is the opportunity here? And I think that kind of ties in to the third strategy or third that you're talking about.
Let me add one more thing before we jump into the last one. When it comes to team as well, we have to make sure one major issue is you have to be transparent with your existing team on what needs to happen, because if people suddenly change management is one of the hardest things to do for leaders and for companies, and if they're not aware if the employees are not aware of what's happening, and then suddenly you're adding all these new processes and new ideas of products and stuff like that, people tend to get scared, and then they start to panic, and then and then they'll start to resist whatever new changes that it is, and it just becomes a much bigger conversation. And that's why people need to be a part of that decision process, because then they would help you uh, transition much easier and faster into whatever you wanted to pivot into. So that whole concept of being very transparent is very, very, very important. And with that as well, there's something. I promise the last thing I'm going to say about the team thing, but sometimes when people pivot into new ideas or new businesses, some of your old legacy stuff, you know they don't belong, and that's another thing you have to worry about. And do we, if they can't, you go through the training route, but if it doesn't work out for them, what do you do with them now? Do you let them go? Do you recommend them into other people, or like what do you do exactly? And I think that is one of the most, a lot of people think, okay, what's going to happen to our staff? Because they especially if big companies who've been old legacy companies, staff have been there for 10 years plus, 20 years plus, they become more like family. So what do you do with these people? So this is a very important part that people need to answer, especially the leadership of the companies.
Yeah, 100%. I think you're quite right. There needs to come, transparency is the key here, because if everybody's bought into the reason why there's a change and why there's a reason for perhaps upskilling or transitioning into different roles in order to keep the business, so everybody keeps their job, for example, then that can only work if everyone's bought into it, right?
Yeah, 100%. Like if people don't buy into it, never happen.
Yeah.
So
just not last week, the week before, one of the things they've had to do is instigate salary cuts for their organization right across the board. They're only a small organization, about 30 people, but everybody's had to take a short-term salary adjustment. But what they made very clear in starting this was that first of all, we will pay you back. That is the goal here. But not only we will pay you back, they put in two conditions, if you like. One was, okay, if one of these top 3 projects that we're pitching comes in, everyone gets paid back for this period, because you then have complete insight into, yes, the money's with us. Or if one of those 3 doesn't come in, then as long as they hit a certain revenue threshold by the end of September, then again everybody gets paid back. So what that's now done within the organization is everybody is, it's all hands to the pump, right? You've got people within the organization that are doing things that their existing role might be not necessarily redundant, but their existing role is quieter, let's say, from activity standpoint, because they don't have the regular business. So they're still working full time, but they're helping their colleagues perform their roles, because now everybody is working to the same objective, which is ultimately how a company should run anyway, right? Yep. It's only when a company gets so big that we really start to feel kind of isolated in our in our functions. And I guess the sign of a good organization is one where people are responsible for a particular role, but they are loyal enough, I guess it could be a word for it, or even responsible again as an extension to that. Because they feel that they have this agency over their own growth and over the growth of the company. They feel responsible to look after other people within the organization as well. So I think it was just fascinating because I know many companies that have had to make salary adjustments. This was only one company that I'd spoken with that had actually put metrics in place to pay their staff back. Everyone else was just, we'll pay you back when we get the money, which is just too loose a definition from a staffing point of view to keep them motivated, right?
Sure. No, I heard it a lot, but I honestly haven't heard like a payment plan payback from anybody. And good on them. That's I mean, I guess they know what they're doing, and they have a plan, which is good. And I think that's that's maybe that's the fourth pillar we should talk about, is the plan. You need to have like a solid plan for pivoting. You know what I mean? Like you just can't have say,
Yeah.
my gut feeling is if I do this, we will be successful there. So a plan should be there. But anyway, in all cases, let's talk about the third point before we jump off plan
Yeah.
to talk about the plan, right? So yeah,
The
so yeah.
third point then is is the need for an advisory board of sorts, right? Whether that's like you say, a non-exec team or consultant that you bring in. But talk us through that, Abe.
So you know, advisors or advisory board, again, it's always been there, but the term has become very popular in the last 5 years, especially with all these startups.
Mm,
They and 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 I think became very popular because the average age of a startups, you know, is usually a much younger than an average leadership team of an SMB or
mhm.
SMB or even enterprise, and
Yeah,
so they need more, you know. Um,
they've got no time in the trenches, right? So
exactly. So they
their guidance.
they need people with experience to come and tell them, or tell them from experience what happened to them.
Mm,
But that's it's always been there, in all fairness. And
mm,
actually, in the last 5 years, the average age of the entrepreneur as well, of a startup entrepreneur, tech startup
mm,
entrepreneur, has uh, increased tremendously. Like in the US right now, the average age of a startup entrepreneur, tech entrepreneur, is in the mid 40s, while 10
mm.
years ago it was in the mid 20s, right? So
Yeah,
because obviously, they say experience is king, and I do 100% agree into that.
yeah.
um, and so, keeping in saying that, a lot of times, especially in pivots, and especially when we're talking about more established companies, like the tech
Mm,
firm who's been out there for 15 years, or the medical agency who's been there for 30, and all those companies that are really looking to pivot.
mm.
They're not looking for advisors on how do they run the day-to-day business, but they're looking on advisors into the space that they want to get into. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Or they want to get it. They want to get financial advisors to see how, because you know, we say, let's say we talk about some of the companies,
Mm,
and coming back to talent, and they say, oh, tech talent. They keep saying tech talent is expensive. Well, you have this, let's say, food production plant who wants to move into something a bit more techy. Their pay scales are not the same as a tech pay scale. So they need to
yeah.
understand. So they would hire, somebody from that field to actually advise
Mm,
them, or, reach out to an advisor. And not only that, they would not know how to automate certain things, or even
mm,
how to, that whole agile versus waterfall methodology. And for those who don't know what those are, waterfall is, remember the Windows back in the days where, every 3-4 months you used to get a patch, and you click on install and it installs everything. Well, that's called
yeah.
waterfall. While agile, every you can deploy multiple updates in a day to a website without, this website being down or anything like that. So that whole mentality of um,
Mm,
small changes every day makes the product much better. While the
yeah.
waterfall is just here, have it on a CD kind of thing.
Hmm.
I don't know if any people have CDs anymore, but anyway, regardless. So this is so going back to that, you need advisors that would
Yeah.
help you address all these issues, from the technology, from finances, to even domain experts. And sometimes people bring in advisors just because they're a name in that certain ecosystem. You know what I mean? Like you'd bring in the best or the most recognized person in the food business, if you food tech business, if you're a
Mm,
food business wanting to add a technology aspect to it, or you'd
yeah.
bring in somebody from a digital health.
As well, right? If this is something that's going to be uh, let's say public knowledge about, you're moving into a new domain, you're opening up a new product line, for example, you've never done it before, but the fact that you've consulted with XYZ, for example, makes it a credible product now. rather than just, like you say, a short-term pivot to make some quick cash, which is another thing, right? Which is another part of the decision, I guess. Is this a short-term pivot, or is this actually a strategic change
Yeah.
in direction for at least an arm of the business?
And the beauty about that is because technically these companies have a bit of legacy, so they have a brand, at least
Mm,
identity, or a brand equity
yeah.
in the market, so they're well established, so they can leverage that name towards uh,
Mm,
attracting better advisors. And with a better advisor and a name, that usually, more customers would tend to sign up with people like that because it gives them history. And that's
yeah.
that's one of the main issues actually with startups is they might have a great team and they might have everything, but because they don't have history, people are like, well, we do
Mm,
not want to be the guinea pigs, or
yeah.
and that's why a lot of startups fail, is because they're never able to attract their first major customer. Well,
Yeah.
if it's a legacy customer been out there for 20 years, and they're not going to go bankrupt in a day or two, or the next day, I guess. Then and then adding that certain talent, that firepower, those advisors would just help people just get much better and faster into getting into where they wanted to go.
Yeah. 100%. Cool. So look, I think just to kind of to sum up, then I think the reality is this is something that a lot of companies are considering at the moment. Is it, given that the landscape has changed and the new landscape is here to stay, let's say, is it the right time to pivot? I think the reality is it's obviously based on an individual basis, depending on what your current existing business looks like, and what is the extent of the pivot you're considering. But the quicker you do it, the better, because obviously the longer you take, the more cash you burn, especially if you're operating within the same overheads as you have been previously, but obviously with reduced income. So there's a lot of things that are obviously specific to your organization to consider. Um, but the three things, if you like, to make sure you have in place to enable you to make that decision would be obviously get a firm handle on what your finances are, to assess, what is the opportunity cost in switching focus to pursue this new revenue stream. Getting the team in order, so making sure, do you have the right players in place today
Yep.
in order to capitalize on that? If you don't, do you get in a consultant to advise you on that, or do you need to recruit new people? That could be salespeople, that could be marketing, that could be an R&D division, depending on the extent of your pivot. And then the third thing, as you said, is the advisory board, right? And this advisory board really look to give you insights into, again, everything that we've discussed already, but perhaps also, if you're bringing another product to market, then at what price point do you position yourself, right? So
Sure.
there's a number of different factors that need to be considered. It's not just a case of we'll start building X instead of Y, and we'll make a killing like everyone else. How much is that going to cost? How much can you
and,
sell it
and
for?
exactly, and all these 3 points would definitely then jump into the fourth one that we talked about, which is the plan. you know
Yeah,
and it's fine that a lot of these leaders started a business on a gut feeling, or on some insight, and then they built something. But
yeah,
nowadays it's a bit more different. It's a lot different than it was 10, 15, 20 years ago. um,
yeah,
Now you can make good you know scientific guesstimations, I guess the word is, because there's a lot of data out there to find out, like a competitor landscape, to find out talent, and then you need a plan. Like, honestly, like, a lot of people say
yeah,
we want to do this, or like, okay, so what is the first plan? The first plan, then we walk into the finance team and advisors, but then we want to see a realistical time plan. If are we going to build something that's going to take 18 months in R&D? By the time 18 months, people get less enthusiastic about a certain product or a service, so they might
yeah,
fall back on their own way. So there needs to be constant, how do I say this, constant nagging, or
yeah,
constant staying on top of the idea, because and in all fairness, it cannot be a quick, you know, pivot where, you know, you see the money there, you know, and then you jump on that idea. It's like not a one-time hit and run kind of pivot, because that really ruins
Mm,
the brand equity and you know, what you've been building for years and years and years and years.
yeah.
And I see a lot of companies fall into that trap. You know, you know, in COVID, a lot of the companies became, especially the logistics companies, and they became heavy on uh, medical, anything medical equipment. You know, they would import masks, or they would import whatever. Like, and I saw a lot of companies fall into that trap, and now trying to take themselves back into what they were doing, or trying to find something that is sustainable. So make sure
Sorry,
the pivot is sustainable.
yeah, sorry, it just, so sorry, I was just about to read a couple of questions. One of them was by Simon. Thank you, Simon. His question was, have you ever witnessed, so this is to you, Abe, have you ever witnessed anyone who's pivoted, um, but then needed to regress back to their original business plan? I think that's what you were just about to give an example of, right?
Yeah, and you know what, in the startup world, I see that
Mm,
all the time. You know,
yeah,
people, they build something, and then they build something smaller, and they try it, and then it doesn't work, and then they go back to their original plan. So
yeah,
again, um, and 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 that's why usually the pivots are done on a small task force, where they assign one or two people to
mm,
build like a minimal viable product, an MVP,
yeah,
and test it. And once it's validated, and then there's customers for it, and their customers are willing to pay for it, then people
mm,
usually pivot. It's not like, you know, we're gonna stop doing this and start doing this kind of there's always, you know, they turn off marketing, let's say from 100% to 50%, and then they put a bit of marketing on the new pivot, and then they slowly gauge both of them
yeah,
while winding down one. And I see that those are the most successful models, but nobody goes like cold turkey from, you know, one day they're doing this. And I know, I can't mention names, but I know a couple of big companies or startups who started in early 2000s in MENA,
mm,
uh, who are not here with us anymore because of they they just trusted their gut, launched something, and then it totally backfired in their face. So
yeah,
that's something that is not. It's usually be
mm.
done. Make sure there is always a line, a point to back up to again to your original idea.
The other question from Klaus is, so, sorry, one second. So what product lines or businesses have you seen companies pivot into? So in my experience, so what I've been discussing with companies over the last, thank you, Klaus. So what I've been discussing with companies over the last few months are the companies moving into or trying to take advantage of supply chain, cybersecurity services, cloud consulting. Um, One of the interesting ones from a hardware point of view, so the company providing cameras for CCTV, they've actually pivoted into, it's only a slight pivot you could argue, but just an upgrade, if you like, in the cameras that they're offering. So the thermal imaging cameras. So again, this is something they didn't provide before, but now they're doing it because of the current
Sure.
situation. That is only a very, for them, it's a very simple I don't even know if you call it pivot. It's not. It hasn't taken them very far from their
It's
existing
more of a
business model.
feature than an actual product, right? Like they're added that as a feature. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm seeing the same thing, Rich. Like a lot of people that reached out to us are tech firms who are trying to get into security,
Yeah.
are like old school medical firms who are now trying to do more digital health.
Mhm.
Those are and obviously a lot of companies, a couple of really smart ones, I guess, that were utilizing either in logistics, whether they're warehousing or their actual network of cars and trucks and bikes to
Mhm.
deliver certain things. You know what I mean? Like we
Yeah.
actually have a company in our portfolio in Startup Bootcamp who grew tremendously in COVID because they had a big warehouse, and they do you know, they do storage plus shipping and packing, packing and
Mhm.
shipping, sorry. And people were doing it out of like especially smaller online shops, that had Shopify stores.
Hmm.
Suddenly, these guys saw a big influx because these guys can go back to their mini stores or mini warehouses. So they shipped them
Yeah.
off to the startup, and because this guy had a whole operation
Mm.
functioning, so we saw a lot of growth in that. So there is a
Hmm.
lot of there was a couple of industries that really gained.
Yeah.
AI is another big one, by the way.
Mm.
Companies that did AI in anything, whether it's facial recognition, whether it's the thermal imaging for cameras, like you can, go to any mall in these countries and you'll see a thermal camera. And now there you have cameras that not only do thermal, but they do counting. They count how
Yeah.
many people are in a certain area, so for to maintaining social distancing. Uh,
Mm.
but again, like I think these businesses are here to stay. But are they? But as more and more competition comes up right now, it's going to be tougher to maintain their market share. But that's a different argument.
Yeah.
But
It's
so those are the three
interesting.
major things I saw.
Yeah, so one other company I was talking to, they were actually they pivoted one of their production lines, and this admittedly was only a temporary move, but it was more to maintain staff and maintain wages. So this is they belong to they're a tech house, but they're actually part of a larger group that has a textile division as well. And they basically pivoted the textile because that business has dropped dramatically. They pivoted into creating masks, which they're now shipping a lot. He admitted that, look, this isn't really a moneymaker for us. They're literally just covering costs, but it means that we can keep our staff in place
Yeah,
until a time when perhaps we can get back to the normal business, should we say. But I just thought that was quite interesting as well. It was a pivot at a necessity, so it's an opportunity. But for them, it's not an opportunity for growth, or it's just to keep their business stable.
keep everybody. Yeah, exactly. And I did see one or two companies do that. Especially,
Mm.
um, they've converted their manufacturing facility to produce something for, like we even have a company in Italy that did 3D printing, and suddenly
Mm.
they were printing breathalyzers. They're like printing the basic.
Yeah.
Uh, like the outer components for the breathalyzers and they were selling it to hospitals. So you can just put like a scuba tank in there and it becomes like a breathalyzer. So there there was there's a lot of innovation that came out of that, obviously the pandemic. And
Yeah.
these are the businesses that they never had an intention of pivoting
Mm.
respirators, but they were printing all kinds of other things in a manufacturing value chain. And yeah,
Mm.
so and they lost that
Look,
main business that they.
interesting. What's kind of interesting, you talk about innovation, Abe, and I guess even it'd be a really interesting conversation for some SMEs to have with their staff is to, okay, things are tough at the moment. If we were to pivot, if we were to open a new product line, product somewhere, what would that be? And just to engage their staff in these kind of ideas, and maybe even lead the innovation, let the staff lead the innovation to some extent, because I think um, what's really interesting sometimes is sometimes we have, and I remember this from when the days when you and I used to work together. There is so much talent within a lot of organisations, but they're not given uh, license to
Autonomy.
create or
Yeah.
to submit ideas on that kind of scale that can have an effect on the business. And right now,
Sure.
when people are looking for that kind of those impactful ideas, I think now is a fantastic time to engage our employees with in that kind of common conversation.
Yeah, and you know what? Always that's why it goes back to the leadership aspect when we talked about
Mm.
talent. It's a good idea to have a soundboard to just jot ideas and then see what they come back with. Like
Yeah.
we had a lot of business leaders who came up to us and said, "I'm thinking of doing this," and then
Mm.
like from the first question, it wasn't even a challenge. then they would
Mm.
back out of their idea. You know what I mean? Because operationally they don't have it. Logistically they can't. It can't be done, or requires so much cash. You know what I mean? Like, you know what I mean?
Mm.
Like calling certain, some manpower needed was not something that's available that can be in a certain area. You know what I mean? Like, keep in mind
Yeah.
in COVID, we had, not everybody could leave the house without a permit, and so
Mm.
there was a lot of that things that needed to be addressed, and a lot of the ideas came from the frontliners and came from the middle manager saying, no, well, what
Mm.
we can help is we can do this and that, and and innovation, open innovation that is embraced in a company always, in my opinion, always helps companies get a lot more, uh, you know, uh, innovative, and a lot on that creativity edge. You know what I mean? So I've seen that done
Mm.
in many, many, many times, and they do well.
Yeah. No, 100%. Abe, look, we'll just take one more question before we close.
Sure.
Simon again, he's asked, are there any? Sorry, let me just read the question just so I understand the wording. So, are there any pivots, or are there any pending pivots that you haven't yet seen? Simon, correct me if I'm mistaken. What I think you mean by that is, are there any things that are yet to be exploited in the current environment? Is that what you mean with when you say pivots that we haven't seen yet? Yes. Okay. Yeah. So does that make sense, Abe? I think the question.
I think I understand what Simon's trying to get to. I
Yeah.
think I'm going to reword the word pivot into innovation. I think there's a
Okay.
lot to be done, a lot to be done in addressing a lot of the things that we kind of were overlooking, and most of that is in the two sectors. In again, this is my personal. It's in touchless payments. I think in the payments method, because
Mm-hmm.
people like I don't know, most of your people who are on this webcast are probably from the UAE or Dubai, but
Mm-hmm.
as we leave this UAE bubble, that the cash is still is the most way of transacting with any merchant or anything like that. I think the second one, the big one is the digital health. We're going to see a lot more disruption in health.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to see a lot more disruption in education, but education will take a bit more time, because I think the content of education needs to be updated before the actual delivery method will be. But that's why health, I think, is there's a lot of investments going into health.
Mm-hmm.
And so those are the two, and obviously whatever supports both of them, whether it's health, our health data and our financial data, cybersecurity will essentially be the founding, how do I say, the foundation to all of these. But
Yeah.
I see a lot of that in the finance plus the health sectors, and they're all going to be playing on a big tech tech angle. So I think I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, I think so. Perfect. Listen, thanks very much for that, Abe. Thanks everybody for joining us again today. That's all we have time for. So, like I said, Abe, thanks very much for joining us again. We've really benefited, I think, from your insights.
Thank you very much
Guys,
for having me.
thank you, Abe. Look, guys, as I mentioned at the top of the call, if you would like to receive a copy of the white paper that I mentioned already, just type white paper in the chat box when this is prepared. Hopefully within the next few weeks, we'll make sure you receive a copy. Also, if you'd like to become a member of the mastermind community that I mentioned earlier on as well, again, just type mastermind into the chat box, and either myself or one of my team will reach out to you in the next couple of days for an informal chat. So perfect, that's it. We'll be back again in 2 weeks' time, and we'll be discussing, the topic we've got in a couple of weeks' time is a focus on distribution. So how are distributors staying relevant in the current market? So thanks a lot, guys. Thank you, Abe. I'll see you all 2 weeks.